Okay, let me show you something real quick. We're going to be sketching kind of a freeform sketch here, some thing that's going to contain both arcs and lines that aren't necessarily going to be perpendicular to each other. So we're going to introduce you to the three different arc types that we can sketch out, and I'm also going to introduce you to the angular smart dimension. So let's start from the very beginning, and I'm going to introduce you to the three different line types too. I think we've talked about two of them. We've talked about the model line. Model line is a thick line, and it's typically black when it's fully defined. And SolidWorks is going to do something 3D with the solid model line. Then you have a construction geometry, or a centerline, or a construction line. And these are items you put into your sketch to help you drive some of the reference geometry associated with your model. It helps drive those model lines, but SolidWorks will ignore that, and that's a test question. SolidWorks is going to ignore those center lines when it comes to actually creating that 3D feature. It's just there for reference. Now we have a midpoint line, which is kind of new. I think it's about 3 years old. So let's start with the midpoint line and see what that's all about. We know about center lines, and just for the fun of it, we're going to go ahead and choose a front plane up here, and then we're going to go ahead and sketch a line out. I started over here in the middle of nowhere, but what I really want to do is I want to sketch a center line in reference to the origin. So we're going to go up here to center line. We're going to pick up, you can see that dashed hidden line, that dashed line over there, which tells us we're going to at least get that lined up with the origin if we sketch that over there. And because we've already gone through the origin over here, now you can see two sketch relations ready to go. We have a coincident and a horizontal sketch relation. You can see the preview in yellow. So if I sketch that out, now you can see what we have here. So we have a black line, but the two endpoints of that line are undefined. We're going to go ahead and grab the midpoint of this line, right-click on that. We're going to go to select midpoint. We're going to click on the origin, and we're going to make that coincidence. So now we have a center line right down the middle, and we can go ahead and mirror items from the top to the bottom. If we wanted to do that, those would be sketch entities. So let's try this. Let's do something a little bit different. Let's go up here and pick that third line type, which is called a midpoint line. Now before we do this, you'll notice that the origin is all by itself. You have that line that's all by itself. It doesn't have anything really here in the middle. And if we do the midpoint line, what we can do is we can sketch, kind of like a midplane extrusion in a way, on that line, and that line goes off in two different directions. So if you look at the cursor, now we have a preview of a coincident and a vertical relationship. If we were to drop that into place and escape once, now you see we have a pretty good black line. We have two blue endpoints in that line, which means those are underdefined. And same with that horizontal line here too. Now if we wanted to, if we want to use that as reference geometry, we could take that line, left click on it, left mouse button. You get a shortcut menu over here. You could turn it into construction geometry. In opposition to that, you can go over here to the Properties Manager and tell it to be for construction, or not. But the problem with the midpoint line is it has a point down here. All by itself, there's this little point down here. Even if I were to scoot in, the point scales down and you can't really get any closer to it. But you just have to know that that point's there. If you were to break this line up and get rid of it, that point's still there, and it may end up be floating out there. And points are always difficult to find if they're floating out there and you're trying to make your sketch fully defined. So we're going to take that point, we're going to delete it. I just want to show you how to put that in there. And what we want to do is we want to put in another center line, and we're going to put the bulk of that center line down here. So we're not going to pick the midpoint relationship in here, but we're going to make it like kind of a cross shape in a way. Okay, so now that we have our center lines in place, the desire now is to begin to do a freeform sketch. What we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and sketch on one side of our model in the lower half down here below this line, this horizontal line in here. And then we get everything all the way we like it, where it's going to be connected onto this line. We're going to use that line as kind of like an axis of revolution in a way, or just a line that we're going to mirror from one side to the other. So we're going to take everything we have on the left-hand side, ultimately, and we're going to mirror it to the right-hand side. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to do an arc. And you notice up here in our Sketch tab on our Command Manager, we have three different arcs we could choose from. Top one is going to be Centerpoint Arc, and we have Tangent Arc, and then we're going to do 3-point arc. So we're going to do the 3-point arc first. Talk about the Tangent Arc, and then we're going to do a Centerpoint Arc a little bit later. 3-point arc, as it implies, very similar to the 3-point arc in AutoCAD. You pick one endpoint, pick the endpoint, and then you're going to pick a place in the middle where you're going to plant the orientation of that arc. So we're going to start with the origin. sketch that out. Can't really control right now which way the arc's going to bend, but we're going to do that on the next mouse click. So left mouse click down here, and then we're going to go ahead and stretch that out, maybe exaggerate that a little bit off in that direction. And the cursor is going to be resting right in that arc. So wherever we put that cursor is where the arc's going to land. So I'm going to put a point there, but it's going to land that arc where we put it. Now we're going to have to define that a little bit better. So let's say we want to take this arc and we want to make a tangent to that line. So that's a fairly easy thing to do. We could do a selection box from the left to the right. Remember, everything that crosses the selection box left to right gets selected. Whereas if we were to do left to right, I should say from right to left, everything gets selected, everything that crosses gets selected. But if you do left to right, everything that's inside that box will get selected. So if you do left to right, you notice that nothing gets selected. Right to left, things that cross that box will get selected. So we have two items that get selected. A couple things we could do once we do that is we can go over here to Properties Manager, click on Tangent, or the shortcut menu is going to pop up here. We could do tangent up here too. So that's definitely a little bit quicker because you don't have a whole lot of mouse travel, but it takes like a half a second for that shortcut menu to show up. So sometimes you have to kind of wait for that. So now that it's tangent, you can see that it's fairly well defined here. And if you take the endpoint of that arc and stretch that around a little bit, it shows you the degrees of freedom that you have. Let's go ahead and stretch that a bit. So we could define this a little bit better by putting a dimension in that. Let's make that 2.5. And now you see that that arc is fully defined, except for the endpoint of that arc. So that's got some flexibility. This endpoint up here at the top where the origin is, we can't move that, but this one we can. It's blue, it has not been defined. So we could define that a couple different ways. We could put a dimension on that between the top and the bottom, or between left and right, and that would define that. Or we could add additional elements onto that and then define it that way. As an alternative to that tangent line, let's go ahead and click on that sketch relation up here and get rid of that. You'll notice that the center point of that arc, it's planted on that vertical line in here, that vertical center line. So we could do that very same thing too. That also makes a tangent because it may not always be convenient to go ahead and sketch out additional reference geometry. We could do it this way too. So with the control key to press, let's go ahead and select that center point of that arc and that line, and we can make that coincident. So very same thing. Making that coincident also makes a tangent to this line up here. So let's go ahead and sketch a line out on here on this. So we're going to sketch a line roughly tangent to that line up here. You notice that we're not going to get that tangent relationship up here. And you also notice too that all of a sudden we're back into an arc. So as long as we're on that, let me show you what to do. We can select a line up here. And if we sketch a line out here, you can see it's going to be a line. But if you were to take your cursor and take it right back to the end point while you're still have that left mouse button selected and try that point again, turns into an arc. If you go back to that line, still an arc. If you go back to that point, I should say it's still an arc. So you can't really reverse that, but you can take a line and go back to an arc simply by doing something like that. But at this point, we want to go ahead and put in a line. So we're going to go ahead and put in a line. We're going to exaggerate this a little bit. And a lot of times, if you go from the tangent arc or an arc to a line, you can take that tangent arc off of a line. You can pick up that tangent relationship. It's a little bit harder taking a line from an arc and trying to do it that way. But we can establish that tangent relationship again. Pick box, selection box, from the right to the left. We're going to go ahead and select those two together, and we're going to make this tangent. So now we have another way we can define that. We can define this endpoint over here by dimensions off of the vertical and horizontal center lines up here. Or we can do this. We can put an angle dimension in there. So we can put an angle dimension between those two elements. Maybe make that 35 degrees. Now you notice that this endpoint is now free to travel, but everything else is black. So everything we've put in here so far, except for the endpoint of this line, is now black and it's fully defined. Okay, the next item we're going to show you is going to be the tangent arc. We played around with the 3-point arc up here, and I think you have a pretty good idea how that works. Next one's going to be the tangent arc. And it's very simple. You're just going to be selecting 2 points. So with the left mouse button to press, we're going to go ahead and select this point of that line. And we're going to sketch that out roughly down here like that. So keep in mind the center point of that arc. We want to kind of get that almost horizontal to the end point of the arc. So when we drop the end point of the arc down here, Now it's going to give us a capacity to continue sketching here too if we want to do that. And every element we put in there is going to be tangent. At least it should be. That last one didn't quite do that. But let's go and erase these last two. We know we have a tangent relationship between that line and that arc. And we can go ahead and define that arc by putting in a dimension on that. And we're going to make that to maybe 3 inches. So it still looks like it's blue. Like, what are we doing here? How do we define that even further? So now we can see what we need to do. Again, to test your sketch to see what might need to be done in order to constrain it either with sketch relations or dimensions. Take an endpoint that might be in there, one of the blue endpoints, and pull it around and see what you might be getting. One thing we could do is we could take this center point of the arc and that endpoint of that arc, and we can make those horizontal to each other. So the shortcut menu is still showing here. We're going to go ahead and choose that. That's one way we could help define that. That way when the next line we put down here is going to be a vertical line. And now if we take that endpoint of that line and move that around a little bit and see what degrees of freedom we have, we might want to put in a dimension between maybe that point and that center line over here, and that'll define that even better. So between that point and that center line, we're going to make that about 4 inches. So now everything's black, it's fully defined. Let's go ahead and put in some additional elements in here. Okay, so we're going to put in a couple more elements in here. We're going to put in a line, and we're going to put an arc next to that line. Everything is going to be tangent to each other, as we've been doing so far. So one thing to keep in mind here, we're going to put a line from that point down here. We're going to hopefully pick up the tangent relationship when we do that. And if we do pick up that tangent relationship, and because the midpoint of the arc, or the center of the arc, and the end point of the arc are one of the endpoints of the arc, are going to be horizontal to each other. This line we're putting down here, if it's going to be tangent, and it shows a tangent sketch relation preview, that's going to be a vertical line. So it puts in a vertical in here, puts in a horizontal or a tangent relationship up here. So that line is fully defined because of those constraints that we have in there. The endpoint of that line is not fully defined, so we might want to define that a little bit later. So we're going to take the endpoint of this center line, we're going to stretch that down a little bit to kind of give us a little bit more room so we can continue to select this line for references. And the next thing we want to do is we want to put in an arc in here between that point and maybe somewhere out in space out here. And this gives me an opportunity to do the Centerpoint Arc. We're going to do the center point from this line over here, from the vertical center line that we have. And if we take our cursor, right now we're just floating this around our modeling area, our graphics area. If we were to take our cursor and follow that over after picking that line, after not necessarily selecting it, but taking our cursor and resting over that, you can see a horizontal dashed line out here. If we were to pick up this vertical center line here, you can see we're going to get a coincident relationship on it. It's going to maintain that horizontal relationship over here too. So as we stretch that out, we can go ahead and pick up this point of that arc. So you can see the circle that arc could be conceivably sketched over. And our second point we're going to select is going to be that point. So now we can sketch that down, we can sketch that up. And now we're going to go ahead and select that and make that go down a little bit and put that in place. So once you do that, if you do escape, we don't necessarily have a tangent relationship in here. Sometimes it picks it up, sometimes if it doesn't. And if you don't see it, then we're going to go ahead and do our selection box. From the right to the left, select those two elements up here, and we're going to make those tangent. So now you'll notice that we have some flexibility with that arc. And let's go ahead and put a dimension on it. There's a couple things we could do. We could put a distant relationship maybe between that horizontal center line up here and that point. Or you can put a diameter dimension on it, or a radius dimension on it. If we were to put a radius dimension on it, let's just try that one more time. And you notice that that number is the same as this number up here when we do that. Bang. It gives us an error. So it says adding this dimension will make the sketch overdefined or unable to solve. Do you want to add it as a driven dimension instead? So that's the default setting. It means it's driven, which means it's going to be there, but you can't really change its value. It's going to be driven by the geometry that's already in place. Or as an alternative, we can say leave this dimension driver, and if we do that, then we have that error. It's going to remain there. So the reason for that is because between these 2 points in here, between this point and the center point of that arc, because those are horizontal to each other, actually it's up here, because those are horizontal to each other and this is vertical because we put in that line at that point over here on that center line. It's the center line of that arc here too, that by nature that's always going to be 4 inches. So when we change this value to like maybe 3.5, this value of the radius dimension in here is going to be 3.5. So essentially, this dimension here is a radius as well as that. So we have 2 radius dimensions in here, dimensioned in 2 different ways. So we're going to take this dimension where we're going to right click and out, we're going to make that driven. So whatever value we change in this, from 4 to 3.5, this one's going to change too. Okay, so how do we define this? Now this is still going to be underdefined, and what we could do is just put a distance relationship between that point and this horizontal center line up here. We're going to make that 6.5 inches. So we're almost done with that. If we were to take a line and go from the end point of that arc and go to this line over here, you can see that if we get close to where that, it's going into arc again. So we don't necessarily want to do that. You got to be careful about taking that line and going back to the origin of that line. So we're going to try that again. But if you take that line and you get close to what might be the tangent in there, it's going to give us that tangent relationship. So we're going to pick that up. We're going to go ahead and click it on that vertical center line in here. And now we have that almost in place. So if we were to take that line and move that around a little bit to see what sort of degrees of freedom we have, in order to see how we want to constrain this, we can see what we need to do. So we need to define perhaps the distance at that point. I think it would be very appropriate to go ahead and establish a distance between this horizontal center line on top and the end point of that line. It will give us the width or the height of that product we're trying to create. So if we go ahead and click on that point down here, up to this line up here, we'll make that an even 10 inches. And you notice that by making that 10 inches, it doesn't quite work out. So if we approach 10 inches, like maybe 10.25, now you can see what's going to happen. If we go to 10 and 1/8, you can see what's going to happen. So what it's going to be doing is it's going to be approaching almost the horizontal down here. And that line's going to disappear, so it's not going to let us do that. So let's go ahead and put in like maybe 10.5. I think that'll work best. Okay, so we're almost done with this. What we have is all this sketch geometry on the left-hand side. Everything's connected to that vertical center line down the middle. So we should be able to select everything on the left-hand side and mirror it over to the right-hand side. An easy way of doing that, well, one way of doing that is select every element in here with the control key depressed, and then go ahead and mirror that to the other side once you select that center line. Or another way of doing that is to right-click on any element in here and tell it to select the chain. So anything that's connected to that, either a tangent relationship connected to it, it's going to select that. And now we can mirror that to the other side. So if you do that, go over here to the Mirrors Entity, Sketch Entity up here in our Sketch tab in our Command Manager. The last thing it's looking for down here is a Mirror About. And if we were to click inside of that, click on this line over here, and you can see the yellow preview of that. And if you remember, we have everything fully defined over here, so everything should be fully defined on the other side too. If you go to the green check mark, that should be in place. But one thing you'll notice at the top part of our sketch, portion of that model is not fully defined. And if you were to yank and crank on any of these points up here and see what sort of freedom we have with that, you can see what we need to do in order to correct that. A couple of things we could do. And you'll notice that this arc up here, which used to extend from the origin up here down to that point and then a tangent line after that, that arc is no longer there. The end point of that arc is no longer there. SolidWorks doesn't necessarily like, and it's not always good modeling practices, to have 2 arcs right next to each other that are butt-ended to each other, that are co-radial, nor does it like to have 2 lines that are collinear with each other, butt-ended to each other either. It doesn't like that. It's not typically good form when you're modeling. So our SolidWorks automatically just corrects that. It just takes that endpoint out and it's like gone, so we've lost that reference. So how do we get that back? There's a couple things we could do. We can take this arc up here in that line, create a tangent relationship up here, or we can right-click on that arc and we can select the midpoint of that arc too, as well as a line, select the origin up here, and make that coincident too. Either one of those work. And once we do that, it's enclosed and fully defined and ready to go. So you'll notice up here that we do have kind of a gray, kind of a shadow background in here. And SolidWorks puts that there to let us know that we have enclosed geometry. We don't have any gaps in our model. If we had a gap in the model, it wouldn't be gray. And one interesting thing about this is if we continue to add enclosed geometry in here, just as a real quick side, maybe we put some additional circles in here, the additional collision geometry gets darker and darker. So this would be a good time to use the contour select tool. So we might want to do, like if we're doing extrude, a long extrude, maybe click this outside structure out here for one extrude, this for another one, and that for another one, maybe one of these for a hole. And if you want to see about the contour select tool, I have another video about that. But we're not going to do that. We're going to go ahead and take each one of these circles in here, and that was strictly for demonstration to show you how SolidWorks sets this up to let you know that you do have enclosed geometry. So once you do that, we're ready to go. Let's just go to Features, and let's just make that really big, maybe 10 inches, and you can see what that looks like. So, in a nutshell, let's go ahead and open that up, our sketch number 2. It might be your sketch number 1. Let's take a look at this. What we did is we started up here with 3-point arc, started from the origin, worked our way down, put in a line that's tangent to that, and then a tangent arc after that, and then we had a Centerpoint arc down here and show you how to do each one of those arcs. And we have various dimensions in here which help define that, as well as the sketch relations. So we have a number of different radius dimensions in here. This is driven by the model geometry, the one down here. We have a couple distance relationships, distance dimensions in here, and then we have one angle dimension in here. And we can take these elements in here, we can change these around too. For instance, if we want to take this line down here and maybe make an angle down there, we're going to go ahead and make that drive in, and we know what's driving us up here is going to be this dimension. So we can take that dimension over here, and we can make that driven. So we're going to go down here and make that driven, which is going to make this dimension over here a little bit more relevant. A lot of things you could do. In a freeform sketch like this involving lines and arcs, you're going to be using a combination of distance, radius, and angle dimensions to fully define a sketch like this.